So Mr. Patrick Bet David, or as people might know him, PBD. Um, if you haven't caught his podcast, he's got a great podcast. It's kind of like it's a panel form. So there's there's four guys, sometimes five on the podcast. It'll be him, his partner, I think, the Valuetainment partner guy. I'm not sure what his name is, who has his own podcast as well. And then there's I can't remember the other guy's name either, but he's kind of a little bit of a loudmouth guy, which I like him. And then he's got a sensible guy at the end, but he always has a guest. And Patrick Bet David, the good thing about him is it's not the same kind of podcast as you get with like a Joe Rogan podcast where it's a one-on-one interview and it's basically Joe just allowing somebody who's an expert in their field or whatever just to talk and say whatever they have to say on whatever topic it is, and then Joe just curiosity asks them questions about that topic and is basically learning. It's like almost like you're watching somebody learn, which is it's great. I love Joe Rogan's podcast, but this one I like this one because he actually does a different thing where it's almost like an interview, but he grills them with questions too and such. So he'll get somebody from the opposite side of the aisle, or somebody he doesn't agree with. For example, he had he had Andrew Weiner on not too long ago, a couple weeks back or something like that, and that was a pretty chippy podcast. It was funny actually. A guy named Andrew Weiner. I mean, geez, you got to expect you're gonna get some ridicule. But anyway, so he had him on the podcast, and you could tell he didn't like him right off the bat. I mean, so Weiner's, I don't know specifically what he was charged with and what he was convicted of. I know it had to do with like sending pictures to underage girls of his schlong. So I mean, there's that. So I think okay. So here we go. Let me pop this up. This is actually the part of the podcast I kind of paused at where it was funny where he got a little chippy with Weiner. So here we go.
How is it when you think about other candidates? Okay, everybody has a stereotype. You have a reputation whether you like it or not. What's your reputation? Your reputation is you like to text underage girls and you like to talk to girls and you sex sending pictures of your dangling. That's your reputation. Whatever you do, you can't do anything about it. Adam has a reputation.
Of your dangling. I love that. Yeah. So you could just tell like he puts that out there in a way that it's, he's not saying that because he's friendly with him. Like they're going to be friends in any way. He's saying that to insult him, but as mildly as possible, which I think is funny. I've seen him do it with other people, not as bad as with Weiner. With Weiner, he was like, I think he probably had a disdain for this guy just because of the fact that he's a convicted, whatever you want to call him. I don't think he technically did anything with girls. I think it was more like sexting and stuff. So, I know for some people it doesn't matter. It's pedophile's a pedophile. There are levels though. And this guy, he's on the mild level at the very least. Like, he's in the wrong level, but obviously the mild of what it could be. Anyways, let me get back to sort of PBD here. But that's the endearing thing about his podcast because he doesn't really hold back. He asks very tough questions. He doesn't really let anybody get out of it. Rogan's good for that too. But he doesn't let anybody squirm out of a question. He'll make them kind of answer the question or just keep on them until they do or they just don't, and then anybody watching knows that person's just a loser. They just won't answer the question. But I think that's why, among other things, why he has moved. As you can see, here's the top 10 podcast list, Spotify. And this was as of a few days ago, I think. There he is, number 10. So he's moved up. I remember back when I started watching this podcast, I think he was he might have been in the top 100, somewhere in there, but he's number 10 now. And this shows the downward arrow. I think maybe he was at 9 or something, but that's quite a jump. If you look like comparatively, let's go down and see somebody else here. Look, Jordan Jordan Peterson, his podcast 37. I mean, another great podcast. But the difference with that podcast versus PBD's podcast is PBD's podcast is going to actually it's a little bit more energetic. It's going to keep you kind of engaged a little more because you've got more people on the panel. You've got a little bit more discussion going on, a little bit of interjection. I think people kind of like that a little bit too, because if you're just listening to a podcast, like for example, this podcast here, you're just listening to me talk. Either you're interested in what I'm talking about, or you share my opinions, or you don't, and then you just tune out. I think with PBD, it's kind of different. So I think that his podcast could grow. I'm not going to go as far to say he's going to beat Joe Rogan or or take the top spot, but you know I think he could get up to number 3 or something. I think he could really move up because that podcast is really good, and he's getting some really good guests on his show. Just recently, Vivek Ramaswamy, who I did a video about last week, he was on the podcast and he was great. So if you haven't already checked him out, you should check him out because it's a great podcast.